All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, August 12th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream. Whether you're watching me live here or watching the recording back, I appreciate you being here. If this is your first time watching our stream, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about how to get the most out of SaberSim, how to build better DFS lineups, whatever you guys want to talk about. We do the show live for a reason. I want follow-up questions from you guys. I want clarifying questions. I want you guys to be a part of the conversation. These shows go best when we're getting a lot of engagement, a lot of back and forth, some follow-up questions. If you guys have your some 2 cents that you want to throw into the conversation, great. Pop it in YouTube chat or pop it in the Office Hours channel on Slack, and I'll pull it up on stream. These are meant to be kind of conversational, right? They're supposed to be a lot of fun. So we've had some awesome streams so far this week. We've had 3 full days of streams, lots of questions coming in, some interesting topics. So I'm excited to get into it here again today. Bit of a unique day on the baseball front where our main slate, our only big slate of the day, at least on DraftKings. I know FanDuel is a little bit different, is going on right now. There is no real 7 p.m. Eastern lock time with like a big slate of games today. There's one early slate going on right now, and there's a few smaller slates and showdowns mixed in throughout the day. So kind of a unique day for baseball, kind of fun, but plenty to talk about anyway here. I've got a couple questions in my queue, so we'll just go ahead and get right into it in just a moment. But as always, if you've got questions, if you want me to answer something, if there's a specific topic that you'd like me to talk about a little bit or something, get it in YouTube chat now, and I will go ahead and put it in the queue. Get to it as in chronological order with these questions, but I've only got 2 questions to break down. So going to spend a little extra time on both of these, make sure that I provide some good answers to these, talk about everything kind of going on here. But so far, pretty light on questions. So definitely a good day to throw some in the queue if you've got them. But I will go ahead and just jump right in. Got an interesting question from James here, just going to go ahead and get it started off. I think this is a very good continuation of a topic we talked about yesterday, which is kind of thinking about reviewing your results, reasonable expectations of what you can expect for GPP results. We had a user that was basically asking yesterday about reviewing a past slate and trying to optimize a single slate to get the nuts lineup and to get a bink lineup and finding the right settings. And we talked about why maybe that's not the best approach, where it's better maybe to spread out your review, look at a bunch of slates, look at your slates over the course, every single day, review your slates, look at the slates over the course of a full season and determine your results from there. And the reason why is because one slate is just one slate. It's very hard to draw meaningful results from it. What you end up doing if you very heavily analyze one single slate the next day is you basically have just figured out how to optimize for that slate and what took place that day. And it's not always the most helpful thing. And it's better to review our results on the course of a whole season or a whole month at least, or a half season or something like that. So we have another question here from James today that I'm going to get into that I think is very similar to that. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this question up on screen, and we'll talk about it. I'm going to read the question first. So the question says, has DFS gotten more difficult over the years because I'm putting up scores near 150 and I hardly ever cash? There wasn't a single SaberSim lineup built that would have won the 3 entry max contests I entered. I know I'm new to this, but it seems like you have to find the absolute perfect lineup to win. I'm having a difficult time finding that perfect lineup. Any suggestions? The winner of the 3 max had a score above 225 points. It just seems so difficult to build a lineup that competes with those scores. DFS is very hard. So I want to say that first, right? The reason we emphasize contest selection and bankroll management so heavily, it's our first lesson in our baseball course, is because there are very heavy swings when you play GPPs, and you need to pick the right contests and you need to manage your bankroll appropriately so you can capitalize on the edge that you have over a long period of time and survive, right? So I'm going to pull up this spreadsheet. I made a spreadsheet that kind of demonstrates this, and I think it's just very useful to see this on screen. So I'm going to walk through what I'm doing here. And I answered a question similarly last week with another one of these spreadsheets. I think this can be helpful every once in a while just to see something like this. So I'm going to first explain what we're looking at here, and then we'll talk about what we can kind of learn from this. So I'm going to just use a hypothetical example of a player. Hopefully you're using SaberSim. And this player is playing baseball, and they're entering a 150 max that has 50,000 entries in it. That is $1 per entry. So say this is like typical mini max, right? The $1 mini max or something like that. And we're going to assume that this player is 2 times better than the field. And the metric that we're using to dictate that is that they place 2 times more entries than the average player does in the top 1% every single time they play. In other words, if you're entering 150, your expectation is that you're going to put 3 lineups in the top 1% every single time you play the contest, right? First of all, this would be a very skilled player, and you'd be a very consistent player. This would be I want to preface that by saying we're looking at somebody that would do really well. I think even if you are placing 1.5% of your entries in the top 1%, you'd still be a pretty good player, and maybe even you probably wouldn't even actually be doing that every single night, right? So we're assuming a player that's overall very skilled and very consistent, right? So what we're essentially going to do here is we're going to say we're just guaranteeing that 3 lineups of their 150 are always going to land in the top 500, the top 1%, right? And I'm using a random number generator to say where those 3 lineups land in the top 1%, right? From there, I'm doing a very quick, again, this is a very quick and dirty calculation, but I'm essentially saying if they are just in the top 500, they win $10 on the $1. If they're in the top 10, you win $1,000. And if you're number 1 and you bink it, you win $10,000. So very much here an average, a very just generic contest type that would be probably very top heavy, right? But I think for the purpose of this works. So then what I'm doing is I'm letting these random number generators go. It's calculating the winnings you get on those lineups. And then we're also making the assumption that you're winning back $75 from the rest of your entry fees that don't make it in the top 500. Again, this is a very generous assumption, assuming that you're winning back half of everything you enter every single night. This is probably not true for every player, but again, very much of an assumption. And then total winnings, right? So this is the winnings that you get from your lineup 1 in the top 500, wherever it ends up being, lineup 2 in the top 500, wherever it ends up being, winnings from lineup 3, wherever it is in the top 500. And then, of course, all of your other winnings from the other entries in the contest. And then total winnings, right? So then we can look at our net performance on each slate. And on your average contest, even placing this highly, right? 3 lineups, 3% of your lineups are in the top 1%. Your average, your most common outcome is actually going to be losing money. You're going to lose about $45, right? But it comes down to these games where you get those top 10s and those top 1s that really end up making all of your money back, right? So I'm assuming, for example, that we play this out 100 slates. I think there's actually close to like 200 playable slates in an average baseball season because there's multiple slates per day, even main slates, right? Talking about early and main slates and things like that. So I think assuming there's about 200 slates, but we can kind of just rerun these numbers and just get an idea of kind of simulating this average player's performance over the course of a season just by letting these rerun. So let's look at this one. This is a random sim, right? It's always the same every single time. This time, this player, they only had 1 lineup come in the top 10 in their entire 100-day sample, and they lost money, right? Net. All they did is a single lineup. Now let's test again. So we're just regenerating basically how the performance of those top 3 lineups goes. Okay, so now you have 4th and 5th on the 27th and 30th slates you played. You have some decent days you have an 8th place on the 44th day, 3rd place on the 55th day, right? A little less of a loss. Not so bad, right? Let's try another one. Okay, so a few top 10 finishes. Okay, boom. A 1st place on your 49th slate, your 3rd lineup that placed in the top 500, binked the contest, you won $10,000, and you are up almost $11,000 on the season or on these 100 slates, right? But you can see the exact same player, still a very skilled player with the assumptions we're taking in this. In the last 2 sims, we just did sims. I'm calling it a sim, but really what we're doing is just randomizing numbers. They lost money, right? On the first one, they lost a lot of money. Let's do it again. Right? I was doing this all morning just because I think this is really interesting. Okay, so now let's look at this one. So again, like a 7th place, 9th place, 7th, 7th, 3rd, 6th, 1st on your 88th slate, 6th, another big 100 slate sample, right? Let's do another one. Oh, I did 2 that time. Okay, so you won 1st place on the 28th slate. You won it again on the 37th slate. Then you had a couple nice finishes here. You won it again on the 65th slate. Huge season. 27 grand in, right? And you can just keep doing this. But you can see how much variance there is here in terms of what your actual ROI and profit looks like for a player like this, even assuming all the assumptions are the same. That's just the natural variance of the game. And that's why it's so important that our contest selection strategies and our bankroll selection strategies and that are sound, because we need to give ourselves time to recoup this. And even if you had a bad sample Let's see if I can get another bad sample, right? Okay, this might be a good one. Not really. Anytime we don't get a first, which does happen sometimes, if we don't get a first, it looks pretty bad. It looks like we're maybe, it looks pretty bad, right? Without a first place, you typically don't profit, right? Let's see. I really want one. Okay, so here's like a decent one, right? So just a second ago, we saw like 25 grand of profit playing this way because we banked 3 lineups. This one, we end up with a top 10 on 1, 2, 3. This one's a pretty nice day. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? 8 slates, and we have a decent little profit. But if you were judging this purely by profit, you would get different results. You would get a different impression than if you were judging this by top 1% equity, which is the way you should judge it. And if you're looking at a single slate, this is essentially what we're doing when we say, I did bad last night, and I don't know why, and I'm trying to figure out why. We're saying, okay, I'm going to look at this one. And you're digging in here, and you're saying, I'm going to look at this. And you're running sims, and you're back testing, and you're trying to tweak the lineups, and you're trying to figure out what went wrong. Well, when you put it out in this, when you get the wider frame of mind, you can kind of see how meaningless this is, right? This slate doesn't even matter. It's just one. It's one where you were playing your process, you used your process, you know your process works, and you lost $50. You lost a third of your investment, and you can see it just didn't pay out, right? So it just doesn't make sense to do that. Even if you look at a week, if you're just saying, okay, I've been working really hard on my process the past week, I've played 7 slates, I've been trying to do a new process here, and I'm looking at these 7 slates. Is that 7? 1, 2, 3. That's 8, whatever, for example, right? So I'm looking at these. I lost all this money. This process isn't working, right? Doesn't make sense. You can't think about it that way, right? So I think with like the questions here overall, right? Again, looking at this, the winner of the 3 max had a score above 225. Great. That's fine. That is what it is sometimes, right? Sometimes you're that winner. And another way of looking at this is basically like when you're thinking about everything from your top 1% equity, what you're actually saying is that I'm trying to get more lineups than the field does in that top 1%, and then win that 500-person GPP from top 1% to first overall, right? If I have 3 lineups in the top 1% of this contest every single night, and the field only has on average 1.5, right? That's the actual average. More often than not, this is going to pay off for me. And you can see that too when we're also running these test things, right? More often than not, it works out for us. Here's a bad one, right? We lost money. We had a bad season. Run it again. We basically broke even, right? Run it again. Pretty big year, $10,000, right? But we know our process is working. And this is when I'm talking about reviewing and seeing how many lineups you have in your top 1%, in actual score in review mode. That's kind of why I'm saying this, is because if you can at least demonstrate that you're putting more than your fair share of lineups in the top 1% over a long period of time, eventually it's going to pay off for you. This is kind of the math to prove it. So we've got a few other people that have joined me here watching now since I first started talking about this. And I know this is not intuitive at all if you just watched in and you're like, what is going on here? So I'm going to real quickly kind of re-describe what we're looking at here, just so people can get caught up. So we're making an assumption that a player is maxing out a 150 max, something similar to the mini max, and they put 2 times as many lineups as the field average does in the top 1%, which means they have 3 lineups in the top 1% every single time they play the slate. I'm using a random number generator between 1 and 500 from there to determine where those lineups actually place. And then just using dummy values of $10,000, $1,000, and $10 to determine how much you win. Basically looking at random 100 slate samples of what that player's performance might look like over the long period of time to demonstrate how variant DFS and GPPs are, even if they're profitable for a very skilled player, right? We're making assumptions that assume that somebody's overall very skilled, right? My floating for reference, my floating on MLB, which is probably my best sport overall, is about 1.7% of my entries go up in the top 1%, right? So I'm actually not even as good as this hypothetical player that we have here. Not to say I'm like the best player in the world or anything like that, not even close, right? But I have about 1.7% of my lineups make it in the top 1%. So when I put together charts like this, it demonstrates that if I trust this and think about things over a long period of time and allow myself enough bankroll management and proper contest selection to realize the edge, eventually the edge will be realized. But even after 100 slates, sometimes it's not realized yet, right? We could do this for long. The longer your sample is, the easier it is going to be to realize your edge, right? Let's run another one. Right? And it really comes down to these big ones, right? When there's a 1 there, you just have a huge year. So, James, I don't know if you're tuning in here today. Let me know if that was kind of helpful to you. But I just want to emphasize for everyone watching here, right, that it comes down to bankroll management and contest selection, and knowing, and first of all, giving yourself a big enough sample to know that you resemble this player, and that's really like how you realize this edge, right? That's how it all comes together. So, but you see, I mean, look at this. What is that? 26 straight slates of losing. That kind of stuff can happen. And that's not even as bad as it can get. You could probably get a lot worse than that. Look at this one. Holy smokes. Look. Right? 73 straight slates of losing. 2 lineups over the whole season that made it in the top 10. You lose $2,400. But again, general assumptions here powering this are that this player's skilled. And most of the time, they're going to profit. But you really gotta be patient with this stuff. So don't want to beat a dead horse here. I have a tendency, once I get kind of excited talking about this topic, to just start going in circles. But I love this kind of stuff. I feel like it's so important, and it's not really talked about often enough. So I wanted to spend some time on it because there's been some questions here this week about reviewing your results and win expectations and what is a realistic return. And I guess the last point I'll make on this while I'm talking about it, this is also why even ROI and profit as a means of determining how skilled you are as a player can be very, very dangerous. And it's why it's better to look at things from your top 1% equity, your finish position equity, than ROI. Because if you played exactly like this player and had this season, you might assume that you're a bad player and your process isn't working. And vice versa. I mean, we could make a chart that was a perfectly average player, right? We could change this to be a perfectly average player, and they're still eventually going to have these just huge seasons because there's that natural variance here, right? But so let me know. I got a few more people watching here now. If that was helpful to anyone, but especially James, who asked the question, and if anybody is looking at this and is like, what is this guy talking about? Where's SaberSim? Like, what's happening here? Let me know that too, because I'm happy to answer some questions, but I feel like this is huge. This is like paramount. This is a very important concept for people to understand and internalize in your process. So, but for now, I'm going to move on. I'm going to answer some of these other questions here, and we'll keep it moving. So I see a couple questions have trickled in on YouTube. That's awesome. We'll get to those in a moment. I have one other question that came in before the show started here, and that is from TMB in Slack, and it is definitely a little more SaberSim focused here. So we'll get the question in. I'll change my screen over to SaberSim. I've got the slate that's ongoing here loaded in for now because we don't have a main slate for tonight, but we'll talk about this. So TMB said, we are told not to use a cash lineup in GPPs because they are GPPs and require upside. But when creating a cash lineup with SaberSim, you get a SaberScore of 100, indicating it's a high upside lineup, even if it's a cash lineup. So why are we getting a high upside cash lineup? Would we not want to use it in single entry GPPs? So that's a good question. So a few notes here. So when we run a lineup, let's go ahead and build some cash lineups and say we were doing it for this slate here. Let me adjust projections here slightly so we can get these lineups in. Build our cash lineups. We'll build 20 of them. So SaberScore is standardized to 100 so that the best lineup of any given build is always going to read as a SaberScore lineup of 100. Now, that SaberScore is not meant to compare lineups between builds run at different settings. So when this lineup comes through and it has the best SaberScore lineup, it is saying this is the best possible lineup you could run in this contest that you specified which is a cash contest, right? It does not mean that this lineup is GPP viable because it was built using cash settings, right? It goes the other way too. You wouldn't want to necessarily run a build for a tiny single entry GPP between you and 99 of your best friends, and then take the number one SaberScore lineup in this build and use it in a huge top heavy 150 max just because it had a SaberScore of 100. So that's another very important SaberSim concept to internalize. SaberScore is meant to compare lineups within a single build, not lineups that are in different alternate builds, right? So it is always a representative of how good of a lineup we feel it is to be run in the contest that you've selected and specified. The 100 SaberScore lineup for this contest is going to be different than the 100 SaberScore lineup for this contest. And it's going to be very different for this contest, right? So it's always best to think about those. SaberScore is only meant to compare lineups in between a single contest. And I think actually when you're looking at cash, you're going to see very, very little difference, if any at all, between projected score and SaberScore. I don't think there actually is any difference. It should give you the exact same lineups. Oh, it looks like there's this number's changing. So there's like a tiny difference here with one player exposure as far as I can tell. So there might be one lineup at the very end of the pool that's getting flipped in and out based on SaberScore projected score. But the chalk optimal, or not the chalk optimal, the cash optimal should pretty much generally be the highest projected score lineup and SaberScore lineup. So don't use your cash lineups in GPPs. Definitely don't do that. Cool. TMB, don't know if you were watching along. Let me know if that was helpful. If not, happy to return to that here. I've got a question from Andre.com in YouTube. What time should you start building lineups? Is the opto more accurate after a specific time of day, not factoring in late scratches? Yeah, so it depends a little bit on the sport, of course. In baseball, I would say if you can, build your lineups after all the lineup cards are out, right? If we have every single team's lineups, that's the best time to do it. Of course, it doesn't always work out that way, especially on these day slates. I know for a fact for this particular slate, we did not have every team lineups. I think we had all of these first four early games. We had the Brewers and Cubs right at the last second, I think, and then these afternoon games were not in yet. So when that happens, it depends on how comfortable you are with time. I would say for the average player, I wouldn't ever start building lineups earlier than an hour before lock or later than 30 minutes before lock. I typically start my process right at about 20 to 30 minutes before lock, but I'm very dialed in with my process. I've got it down really pat. I typically kind of have an idea based on research I've done throughout the day of how I want to attack the slate. And most nights I'm confident that I can get all of my lineups in, get everything where I want it in 20 minutes to 25, 30 minutes, something like that. So I would say for baseball, if you can afford to, definitely wait, give yourself as much time to get all the lineups in as possible, because then you don't have to worry about late swapping or quick swapping or anything like that later. But if the lineups are not coming out and you're getting to about 30 minutes before lock, it's probably time to start. You can always quick swap or late swap those later, provided that you have access to our entry editor, right? Our entry editor is awesome. It has a late swap and quick swap tool to help you make changes to your lineups while still building high upside correlated lineups after lock. It has a free trial in the account management tab up here in the upper right. You can add a free trial and try it out. Highly recommend it, right? Definitely useful for baseball and slates like there are today. Can definitely be useful. But on a sport like basketball or something like that, where you are late swapping constantly, it is just absurdly valuable, right? I can't even describe how much it changes your process once you start incorporating that late swap in there. But yeah, again, it's sport specific. On basketball, I don't think you have we'll talk more about basketball when we get to basketball season, but I don't think your basketball process is truly viable unless you're comfortable running it in about 10 minutes or less. I think that's an important part of developing a basketball process, because news that changes the slate breaks almost every single day, sometimes 10 minutes before lock, right? Even if the games are starting at lock, sometimes player news comes out 10 minutes before. In that case, I think it probably makes sense. In basketball, I typically start my final build at about 15 minutes until lock, get my lineups in, and then give myself the option, if I need to try to run a very quick final build, sometimes 5 to 10 minutes before, if news is continuing to break with questionable players and things like that. Football, I would say a lot of times I will be running lineups even on like Saturday night. I might even be pretty well dialed in on how I'm going to attack the slate. And then come Sunday morning, depending on, there's questionable players in football too, especially as the season gets going on, but sometimes maybe only making minor changes at that point and rerunning like a final build an hour, 30 minutes before the football games start. Golf, you can typically, as soon as tee times are out, you pretty much can start building lineups. I know we were a little delayed on getting our projections out for golf earlier this week, but I think you can even build lineups on Tuesdays sometimes and just keep an eye on withdrawals. Same thing for a sport like MMA, right? You can build your lineups as soon as we kind of have all the fights, and I guess once weigh-ins are done, while keeping an eye out for withdrawals. So it really is sport dependent, but I would say for your average sport, 30 minutes before lock is totally fine. And I think that's a good way to go about it. So, okay, so another question here. Can you give an example of how to use the tool to play high stakes entries on FanDuel and DK? I'll say this. We don't have different slider settings or anything like that set for differences in stakes. They're typically more contest type derived. I think that is a better factor in determining why you would want to play one contest differently than another. I guess let me put this another way. I think a contest looking like this, so a single entry between 1,000 and 10,000 people, has more in common. A $1 contest looking like this has more in common with a $250 contest that looks like this than a $1 contest that looks like this has in common with a $1 contest that looks like this, right? I don't think stakes needs to be a significant factor in determining how you want to build your lineups. I would say in general, pick the contest sliders that match the contest type you're playing regardless of stakes, and roll with it there. I think at the higher stakes, you're probably going to see a little bit more efficient ownership. So in other ways, you're going to probably get a little bit less out of fading chalk because sharper players at higher stakes are going to be a little bit more efficient with their lineups. But I don't think it would dramatically impact the way I would build my lineups, the difference in stakes. I don't play a lot of high stakes, first of all, and I would only recommend playing high stakes if you filled up all the action you can get at all the other stakes, right? If you told me I'm playing the $100 single entry contest every night, I would hope to hear from you that you are also playing the $1, the $2, the $3, the $5, the $12, the $25, and the $50 single entries, because as you go lower in stakes, the contests are going to get softer. So that would be, the biggest thing behind this question, I would first want to make sure of that. If you're, don't necessarily just take your bankroll and apply it to the highest stakes possible, right? You should be filling up and getting as much action at the lower stakes as possible, especially below $3 before you jump to play higher stakes. But if you have a large bankroll and you're playing a lot of the higher stakes stuff, I would say I don't think you need to differentiate dramatically based on stakes. I think your differentiation in terms of your overall strategy, what sliders you're using, how you're going about building your lineup should be more representative of the contest style, entry limit, and entrance overall. So, but good question. Really good question. That's all I've got in my queue, guys. We are here about halfway through the show here. So had a decent little start here. Does anyone have any other questions for me? Anything you want me to talk about? Again, doesn't really need to be a full question. If there's like a certain topic or something that is interesting or you want to chat about a little bit, that's totally fine. Yesterday we had some interesting kind of random conversations come up in the second half of the show. I'll give this a couple minutes here, see if anyone has any other questions. We got a decent little audience here in front of me here today. So if anyone has any questions, pop them into chat. Give this a couple minutes. If not, though, sit here and have you guys just look at me all afternoon. So we can always kind of cut it off early. But really good questions, really sharp questions today. Appreciate everyone that has kind of participated so far here. Anyone doing well in this day slate going on so far? How are the lineups looking? I ended up taking very aggressive stands with this slate early, both on pitching. My process was leading me to thinking that Woodruff and Gonzalez, the two like chalkiest pitchers probably on the slate, were going to go over-owned. So I took very aggressive stands with those pitchers. We'll see how that pays out. I don't know how Woodruff has gotten started, and I think he's coming in a little bit lower owned than I expected. So we'll see if that pays out. Maybe there's not as much leverage there as I thought. But anybody have any decent lineups? How's things looking on the early slate for everybody, or the main slate, whatever it is? But anybody playing this showdown here tonight? This is going to be kind of a fun one too. This New York and White Sox showdown is at the Field of Dreams in Iowa. So it should be a little bit of a unique contest. I don't know if DraftKings or FanDuel is doing any extra large or promotional contests for it, but kind of a cool game, at least to watch. Should be kind of fun. So all right, guys, it looks like radio silence here. I'm not getting any other questions. That's totally fine. We've had quite a rocking week here on Office Hours already, and we've gone over a couple days here answering questions. So that is totally fine. It is Thursday here. We've got one more day this week. So I will be back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern for another day. If you have questions that come up overnight tonight, you're thinking before you get to bed, brushing your teeth, you got a question for me about DFS, run to the computer, pop it into the Office Hours channel on Slack. I'll get to it first thing in the morning. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of the day of kind of spread out baseball here. Good luck if you are playing golf for the Wyndham Championship. And I will talk to you guys all here again tomorrow. Until then, take care. See ya.